A wealthy white woman refused to leave a seat she didn't pay for, but the black man standing in the aisle wasn't just another passenger. He owned the entire airline. Devon Mitchell moved down the narrow first-class aisle with the kind of measured steps that belonged to a man who had spent 3 days running from one Manhattan boardroom to another. His shoulders carried the fatigue of endless investor meetings, his mind replaying slide decks and financial forecasts. But what he wanted now was not another negotiation. He wanted peace, a seat by the window in 2A, a glass of water, and the quiet hum of an aircraft to lull him toward rest. His boarding pass was crumpled at the edges from the rush through security, but the numbers were clear. 2A, first class, Pinnacle Airways Flight 1847. Yet when he reached the row, the seat was already occupied. A blonde woman with perfect posture and an even more perfect manicure sat with her phone raised close to her face, scrolling through properties that gleamed across the screen, mansions on the coast, penthouses with skyline views, estates with more land than most families could ever dream of. She didn't glance up, not even when Devon paused beside her. She had arranged her bags across the space as though it were an extension of her living room. The Louis Vuitton handbag on the seat beside her looked less like luggage and more like a marker, a flag planted firmly in the soil of territory she had claimed. Devon cleared his throat softly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but steady. "I think there's been some mistake. My boarding pass says this is 2A. The woman lifted her eyes for the briefest moment. Blue, sharp, dismissive, they moved over him quickly and returned to the glowing screen. Her expression carried a kind of casual evaluation, the sort people performed without thinking, the kind that sorted strangers into categories of worthiness within seconds. Then she smiled, a small, cool smile without warmth, and spoke in a tone polished by generations of entitlement. "I'm sure we can work something out," she murmured. "Perhaps you could find another seat. I've already gotten quite comfortable here." The words drifted into the air like perfume, sweet on the surface, but carrying a sting that lingered. Devon stayed still, his hand tightening around the boarding pass. He was dressed for comfort, not performance, dark jeans, a black hoodie, expensive sneakers that most people wouldn't recognize as costing more than rent. Years ago, he might have chosen a suit and tie for the journey, a uniform to shield himself from doubt and questions. Today he had chosen ease, though he knew too well that comfort was never free when you looked like him. He tried again, keeping his voice level. "This is my assigned seat, 2A. This time she looked directly at him, her head tilting slightly, her smile fading into something more calculating. Her gaze lingered on his hoodie, his sneakers, his skin. It was not the look of someone correcting an error. It was the look that said, without words, people like you don't belong in places like this. Around them, the quiet stirrings of other passengers began. A man 2 rows back leaned slightly to see. A woman with a magazine lowered it, but didn't meet Devon's eyes. Some chose to ignore the standoff entirely, burying themselves in phones and headphones, pretending not to notice. It was the universal language of avoidance, of not wanting to get involved. Devon glanced down at his watch, a gesture more about composure than time. Beneath his sleeve rested a Patek Philippe he had purchased after his company's IPO, a quiet reminder of the years he had spent building something from nothing. Yet none of that mattered here, in this cramped aisle, where wealth and power were invisible beneath fabric and assumptions. He inhaled slowly. "Ma'am, if you could just check your boarding pass. I think you'll see there's been a mistake." She laughed lightly, as though he had made an innocent but amusing error. Her phone glowed again, illuminating her painted nails as she tapped the screen. "I'm a Pinnacle Platinum member," she said, her tone carrying both pride and dismissal. "I specifically requested a window seat. These things happen. I'm sure the flight attendant can find you something more appropriate." The word settled like a challenge, sharp and deliberate. Devon felt the weight of it in his chest. Appropriate. It was the same word that had shadowed him through Harvard classrooms, through boardroom doors, through every conference where he was the only black face in the room. It was a word that suggested his place, his presence, his very existence in certain spaces was conditional. He straightened, holding her gaze now. The hum of conversation, the shuffle of passengers stowing bags, the muted clatter of closing overhead bins, all of it seemed to fade. In its place was the silent electricity of confrontation, that fragile space where politeness teetered on the edge of open hostility. Devon did not raise his voice. He did not move closer, but something in the stillness of his presence, in the steadiness of his eyes, carried the promise that he would not simply disappear, not this time. And though there was no dramatic twist yet, the first seed had been planted. It was there in her cool smile, in the dismissive tilt of her head, in the laughter that wasn't laughter at all. The seed of contempt, small but poisonous, already sprouting in full view of an audience that didn't know yet what they were about to witness. Devon extended his boarding pass again, the paper worn from his grip, but the numbers as clear as the first moment he had printed them. 2A. His voice carried no sharpness, only the steady rhythm of a man too tired for games. "This is my seat," he said, holding it where the woman could not ignore it. Victoria Hartwell shifted slightly, tilting her head as if to humor a child. Her lips curved into a smile that gleamed with polish but not warmth. She leaned back in her chair, one manicured hand resting lazily on the armrest. Her voice came out light, almost playful, yet laced with something poisonous. "I'm sure first class is a little confusing your first time." The words landed in the cabin like a spark on dry grass. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper, eyes flicking between Devon and the woman. A couple two rows back whispered, one shaking her head slowly. Another passenger drew in a breath through their teeth, the sound sharp enough to cut the silence. Devon let the words hang there, the sting of them obvious, but he refused to give her the satisfaction of anger. He raised his eyes, calm and unyielding. "This is my seat. The ticket doesn't lie." For the first time, her smile faltered just slightly before it reshaped itself into something sharper. She let her gaze sweep over him again, deliberately slow, pausing on his hoodie, his sneakers, his skin, before lifting her chin. "Perhaps you don't understand how this works," she said, her voice honeyed but firm, every syllable dripping with practiced superiority. "I've been flying Pinnacle for years. I'm a platinum member. I requested this window specifically. Mistakes happen. The staff will find you something else, something more appropriate." That word again, appropriate, like a gate slamming shut. The cabin seemed smaller now, the walls pressing inward, the recycled air suddenly too thin. Devon could feel eyes on him, not just hers, but a dozen others weighing him, measuring him, some sympathetic, some indifferent, a few openly skeptical. He kept his shoulders square, his voice even. "Ma'am, the mistake is not mine. My boarding pass says 2A, you are in 2A. She gave a short laugh, sharp enough to slice the air. "Sweetheart, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be. I'm already settled. Look around you. Does this look like the kind of error that usually happens? Really, when was the last time you flew first class?" The question was a blade disguised as a courtesy. Several passengers glanced away, embarrassed for him or perhaps complicit in their silence. Devon heard the blood rushing in his ears but refused to show it. Years of negotiations, years of being underestimated, had taught him the value of composure. He repeated, quieter this time but firm enough for her and the listening audience around them. "This is my seat. The ticket doesn't lie." Her expression tightened, her confidence hardening into something colder. She shifted, adjusting her designer jacket, her phone still glowing with luxury listings as if to underline her place in the world. "I have flown this airline for over a decade," she continued, voice crisp. "The crew knows me, the system knows me. I belong here. Platinum means priority, and Pinnacle knows how to treat their valued clients." She said it loud enough for those nearby to hear, as though declaring her status could rewrite the facts. Devon stood still, silent, boarding pass steady in his hand, his patience wrapping around him like armor. The escalation was subtle but undeniable. What had begun as a smile and a soft suggestion had sharpened into a declaration of rank, of entitlement, of hierarchy. Her words floated through the cabin like perfume laced with venom, and the passengers inhaled it whether they wanted to or not. The air itself seemed to shift, heavy with tension, with expectation, with the knowledge that this was no longer about a seat. It was about belonging, about place, about who was allowed to claim space without question. Devon did not move, did not raise his voice. He simply stood his ground, the weight of his presence more powerful than any argument. And though the real explosion had not yet come, the fuse had been lit. The soft chime of the call button broke the stalemate, and moments later a flight attendant appeared, her polished shoes clicking against the carpet, as though she had rehearsed this walk countless times. Sarah Chen wore the practiced smile of someone trained to diffuse tension before it grew into something larger, her dark hair pulled neatly into a bun, her uniform pressed to perfection. She glanced quickly between Devon and Victoria, her eyes assessing, already leaning toward the explanation that seemed easier to accept. "Good afternoon," she said brightly, her tone as carefully modulated as the lighting in the cabin. "I understand there's some confusion about seating. How can I help resolve this?" Victoria leaned forward instantly, her voice slipping into the practiced cadence of a wronged customer. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I'm Victoria Hartwell, platinum member for over a decade. I specifically requested this window seat, but this gentleman insists it belongs to him. She gestured toward Devon with a dismissive flick of her manicured hand, as though he were an inconvenience rather than a person. Sarah turned to Devon, the brightness in her smile dimming by a fraction. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Devon handed it over without a word. She studied it, and a faint crease formed between her brows as she compared the numbers to the glowing sign above the seat. "It does appear that you're assigned to 2A, Mr. Mitchell," she said slowly, then her eyes darted back to Victoria. "However, I can see that Mrs. Hartwell is already settled, and she is one of our valued customers. Perhaps we could find another excellent seat for you, maybe 3C, plenty of legroom. And of course, we'll ensure you receive priority service as compensation." Devon's voice came low, steady, but with an edge that sliced through the false brightness. "So the solution is always the same. Ask the black man to move." The words carried across the cabin, and the hum of background conversation evaporated. Passengers froze, some staring openly, others pretending to look away while straining to hear every syllable. Sarah's smile faltered, the professional mask slipping just enough to reveal discomfort. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly, her tone tightening. "We're simply trying to keep everyone comfortable." Comfortable. Devon let the word linger in the silence, heavier than it had any right to be. "Comfortable for whom?" he asked quietly, his gaze locked on hers. Sarah opened her mouth, but no answer came. Before the silence could stretch further, the sound of firmer footsteps approached. Captain James Rodriguez, with his gray temples and commanding presence, stepped into the cabin. A man who had spent decades in cockpits now found himself cast as arbiter in a theater he had not chosen. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice carrying authority but also impatience. "I understand we're having an issue with seat assignments. We need to resolve this quickly so we can depart on schedule." Victoria brightened instantly, rising slightly as though greeting an old friend. "Captain Rodriguez, thank you. I'm afraid there's been some kind of computer error. I've flown Pinnacle for years, always in first class, always in this seat. This gentleman insists it belongs to him." She smiled, gracious and confident, the performance of a woman certain that authority would fall in her favor. Devon held out his boarding pass again. "This is my assigned seat. She has no pass for 2A and refuses to move." The captain studied the slip of paper, then looked at Sarah, then at Victoria, the weight of all eyes in the cabin pressing on him. "Mr. Mitchell, I see your assignment," he said carefully, "but Mrs. Hartwell is a long-time platinum member. Sometimes these situations require flexibility, a compromise that works for everyone." A faint murmur rippled through the cabin, disapproval from some, relief from others who wanted only to move on. Devon inhaled slowly, his patience straining. "So the compromise is that I give up what I paid for, what I am entitled to, so she can have what she wants." The captain shifted uncomfortably, choosing silence over affirmation. Victoria's lips curved into a victorious smile. She leaned back, her hand brushing against her handbag like a queen resettling her crown. Then she spoke, almost under her breath, but loud enough to carry in the stillness. "You people always want to make trouble." The phrase cracked through the air like thunder. Several passengers gasped, one woman covering her mouth with her hand. A man muttered something under his breath that sounded like disbelief. Devon's chest tightened, not with surprise. He had heard those words too many times, but with the grim recognition that the quiet contempt now had a voice. He looked at her for a long moment, the cabin heavy with the knowledge that this was no longer about a seat on a plane. It was about something older, deeper, uglier. Victoria met his stare with a look of cold certainty, confident still that status and connection would shield her. And in that instant, the personal confrontation became something larger, the private indignity exposed for all to see. The seed planted in a dismissive smile had blossomed into something undeniable, a declaration that transformed the air in the cabin from tense to explosive. The silence after Victoria's words was brittle, the kind that threatened to shatter with the slightest sound. It was broken not by Devon or the captain, but by a calm, steady voice from row 3. "Excuse me," the woman said as she rose from her seat, her badge glinting against the tailored lapel of her blazer. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm a senior correspondent for the Washington Post." The weight of her introduction shifted the cabin's atmosphere in an instant. Passengers straightened, some craning their necks, others whispering quickly, the recognition of authority moving through them like a current. Elena's gaze cut cleanly between Victoria and the captain, her voice firm but not raised. Discrimination in public is very much my business. The words were not an opinion, they were a declaration, and they carried the gravity of someone accustomed to holding power to account. Victoria blinked, startled, then scoffed, her confidence flickering. This isn't discrimination, this is a seeding mistake. Her tone was sharp, defensive, but the tremor beneath it betrayed unease. Elena did not flinch. She held her phone in one hand, her notebook in the other, every detail already being documented. A black man with a valid boarding pass is being asked to give up his assigned seat to accommodate a white woman who cannot produce one. That is not a mistake, that is bias, and I will be reporting on it. The murmurs swelled louder, no longer whispers but audible gasps of agreement. An older black couple in row 4 nodded gravely, their faces lined with memories of similar humiliations. A young Latina passenger leaned forward, her press badge clipped to her jacket, phone discreetly tilted toward the scene. And near the back, a college-aged woman with oversized glasses and a laptop balanced on her knees lifted her phone higher. Devon caught the glow of her screen and the streaming interface spilling across it. Her voice, youthful and sure, rang out into the charged silence. "I'm Zoe Kim. I've been live streaming this entire exchange. We're already at 400 viewers and climbing. The comments are, let's just say, not very forgiving." She angled her phone toward the aisle, and the screen revealed a flood of messages scrolling too quickly to read. Angry emojis. Phrases like classic racism and hold her accountable, the kind of raw outrage that explodes in real time. Victoria's face flushed red, a crack in her polished facade. "You can't film me without my permission," she snapped. "Turn that off right now." Zoe's smile was small but unshaken. "We're in a public cabin, and when I see a civil rights violation, I document it. That's what my generation does." The words carried both defiance and truth, and a few passengers clapped quietly before the sound was quickly hushed by the tension of the moment. Devon remained still, his eyes moving between Elena and Zoe, two strangers who had stepped into the storm without hesitation. Their presence shifted the balance. It was no longer his word against hers. It was testimony, evidence, amplification. The captain shifted, unease plain on his weathered face. Sarah Chen's hands twisted together nervously in front of her. Both seemed to recognize that the dispute had now slipped far beyond the narrow aisle of first class. Victoria tried to recover, straightening in her seat. Her voice pitched to sound rational. "You're all overreacting. This is about a seat, nothing more. Turning it into something bigger is ridiculous." Elena's eyes narrowed. "Then why did you say you people?" she asked evenly. The question landed like a hammer blow. Several passengers gasped again, and Zoe's viewer count ticked upward at breakneck speed. "The internet heard it," Zoe added, showing her screen to the aisle. #Pinnacle Shame is trending already. Thousands of people are watching this unfold live. Victoria's lips parted, but no sound emerged. The power she had wielded so effortlessly minutes ago seemed to evaporate under the combined glare of journalism and social media. She forced a laugh, brittle and thin. "I didn't mean it like that. I was talking about journalists, about people who stir up drama online, not about—" Her voice trailed off. She knew, and everyone else knew, that it was too late to twist the meaning. The damage was done. The contempt that had simmered beneath her smile since the beginning was now exposed for what it was. Devon's chest rose and fell slowly. For the first time since boarding, he felt something shift inside him, not relief but recognition. The fight was no longer his alone. Around him, strangers had become witnesses, advocates, amplifiers. The quiet injustice of one stolen seat had become the stage for something much larger. The cabin itself seemed transformed. Where there had been whispers and sidelong glances, there was now an audience, engaged and unflinching. Phones were raised, notes taken, posts uploaded. The story had already escaped the confines of Flight 1847 and entered the bloodstream of a society eager to dissect, debate, and demand answers. Victoria crossed her arms tightly, her confidence shrinking into defensiveness. "You're twisting everything. I've flown this airline for years. I'm respected here. None of this is what it looks like." Elena's pen scratched across her notebook. "It looks like a black man being denied the dignity of sitting in the seat he purchased. It looks like systemic bias playing out in real time. And now, it looks like the entire world is watching." The cabin buzzed with energy, the quiet hum of the engines drowned by the rising storm of attention. For Devon, the weight of the moment pressed against him, but so did something else, hope, fierce and sharp. The escalation had moved beyond his control. Yet he understood the inevitability of it. The seed planted in contempt had sprouted, and now it was blooming in the light of witnesses who refused to look away. This was no longer just his fight. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they did not belong, and the reckoning had only just begun. The air inside the cabin felt stretched thin, like a string pulled so tight it might snap at any second. Devon stood still in the aisle, boarding pass still in his hand, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. For a long moment he said nothing. He let the silence linger, let the weight of it press down on every passenger, every attendant, every person who had chosen to look away until they could not anymore. His eyes drifted to his watch, the gleam of the timepiece catching the cabin light, a quiet reminder of the life he had built, of the authority he carried without needing to announce it. Then he looked around the rows of watching faces, some tense, some fascinated, some quietly recording. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, unhurried, but it carried an unmistakable edge. "Captain," he said, turning toward Rodriguez, "I'm not asking, I'm telling you. Ground this flight." The words fell into the stunned silence like stones into water, sending ripples through every corner of the cabin. Rodriguez blinked, caught off guard, his authority suddenly questioned in front of 100 witnesses. "Sir, I don't think you understand." Devon reached calmly into his pocket, drawing out his phone. His fingers tapped the screen with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The passengers craned their necks to see. On the glowing display, a sleek interface appeared, marked with the Pinnacle Airways logo. Devon's thumb hovered over a button that read, "CEO Override, Ground All Flights." He pressed it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the captain's radio crackled, the voice from air traffic control cutting sharply through the charged silence. "Flight 1847, we are showing a CEO override order on your flight. Please confirm status and return to gate immediately." Gasps erupted across the cabin. Passengers twisted in their seats, phones shot higher to capture the moment. Captain Rodriguez's eyes went wide, his voice faltering as he responded to the tower. "This is Rodriguez. Did you say CEO override?" The radio hissed back. "Affirmative, Captain. Order came directly from Skydeck Corporate. Return to gate immediately. Clearance granted." The captain turned, his gaze snapping back to Devon. "Who exactly are you?" Devon slid the phone into his pocket with unhurried precision. He met the captain's eyes, then Victoria's, then the circle of shocked faces surrounding them. "My name is Devon Mitchell. I'm the CEO of Skydeck Innovations. 3 years ago, my company acquired majority ownership of Pinnacle Airways. 65% of this airline belongs to me. From the planes, to the routes, to the seat you're standing in front of, Captain, I don't just have a ticket for this flight. I own this flight." The revelation detonated in the cabin. Some passengers gasped aloud, others whispered furiously, and more than a few sat frozen, their mouths open in disbelief. Victoria's face drained of color, her earlier confidence collapsing into something closer to shock. She opened her mouth, but no words came. For the first time, the woman who had treated the aisle like her stage had nothing to perform. Sarah Chen's face flushed as her earlier suggestion that Devon should move to keep the peace suddenly transformed into a humiliation she could not escape. Captain Rodriguez's jaw tightened as the reality of what had just unfolded settled on his shoulders. Devon's voice carried on, measured, deliberate. "Mrs. Hartwell insisted she belonged here because of her loyalty status. You, Captain, suggested compromise when the facts were already clear. And you, Ms. Chen, thought the reasonable solution was to move me, the man with the actual ticket. But you forgot the most important detail. You forgot who built the systems you depend on, who signs the contracts, who ensures these planes stay in the air. You forgot that sometimes the person you dismiss is the very one holding everything together." He let the words sink in, not rushing, not softening. The passengers were silent now, hanging on every syllable. Victoria finally found her voice, trembling and thin. You can't possibly," Devon's gaze locked on her, unflinching, "can't possibly own this airline. Can't possibly sit in first class because I chose a hoodie instead of a suit. Can't possibly belong here." His voice sharpened. "Mrs. Hartwell, you were wrong, and now everyone knows it." A hush blanketed the cabin, the kind that comes not from fear, but from the awe of witnessing something irreversible. Devon had shifted the axis of the entire encounter. The power that had been wielded against him was gone, stripped bare, exposed as fragile and empty. Authority had reversed, and the ground beneath Victoria's feet had vanished. What began as a stolen seat had turned into something far greater, a reckoning. The aircraft began its slow turn back toward the gate, the engines humming low as if echoing the tension inside the cabin. Devon remained standing in the aisle, his presence unshaken, while passengers whispered in tones that carried both shock and exhilaration. Phones glowed everywhere now, recording every moment, broadcasting it beyond the walls of the plane. The scene was no longer contained. It was spilling into the world outside, growing larger with every second. Sarah Chen kept her eyes down, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her uniform. Captain Rodriguez stared out the cockpit door, his expression locked in the grim realization of a man who had lost control. Victoria Hartwell sat frozen, her earlier bravado stripped away, her face pale beneath layers of makeup. The hum of conversation rose as the seatbelt signs blinked, passengers talking into phones, posting updates, narrating to unseen audiences who were multiplying by the minute. Devon's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. CNN newsroom. He answered without hesitation, pressing speaker so that everyone could hear. The crisp voice of Jake Tapper filled the cabin. "Mr. Mitchell, this is CNN. We've been watching the live streams. Would you be willing to give a statement right now, live on air?" Devon turned slowly, his eyes sweeping the cabin, taking in every witness. Every phone, every gaze locked on him. His voice came low but carried the weight of something more than a corporate title. "This is not customer service. This is civil rights." The sentence hung in the air like a verdict. Elena Vasquez scribbled furiously in her notebook, her eyes shining with the recognition that she had just heard the opening line of a headline. Zoe Kim angled her phone so the comments were visible to those around her. The messages raced past in a blur. "We've all been there." Finally, someone said it. "This isn't just him, it's us." Devon continued, his tone measured but firm. "For too long, incidents like this have been dismissed as misunderstandings. A boarding error, a simple mistake, a matter of convenience. But when a black man with a ticket is told to move for a white woman without one, that is not a mistake. That is discrimination. And it happens every day in ways large and small. To people without cameras, without reporters, without a platform." Passengers nodded. The older black couple in row 4 held each other's hands tightly, their eyes glistening. A young man in the back muttered, "He's right," and the words rippled forward like a current of agreement. The CNN voice pressed again. "Mr. Mitchell, you grounded your own airline. What do you say to critics who call that reckless?" Devon drew a breath, his answer calm but sharp. "Reckless is allowing bias to dictate who belongs and who doesn't. Reckless is treating dignity as optional. I grounded one flight to make a point. That point is simple. This will not continue. Not on my airline, not in my industry." Elena raised her eyes from her notes. "Are you saying you plan systemic change?" Devon met her gaze directly. "Yes. Skydeck technology powers the reservation systems for most major airlines. Starting immediately, we are integrating anti-discrimination protocols into every system we operate. Complaints will no longer vanish into filing cabinets. Every report will be escalated, every incident tracked, every pattern addressed. The same technology that keeps planes in the sky will be used to keep justice in place." The cabin vibrated with murmurs, a chorus of disbelief and admiration. Zoe's phone screen pulsed with hearts, angry faces, applause emojis, a tidal wave of digital reaction. "We've all been there," one comment repeated, like thousands of times. Devon's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Today it was me. Tomorrow it could be you, your father, your daughter, your friend. The question is not whether it happens. The question is whether we choose to ignore it. I will not ignore it, not anymore." The plane rolled slowly to a stop at the gate. Through the windows, passengers could see the blur of cameras, reporters, security officials gathering like storm clouds on the jet bridge. Devon glanced out, then back at the passengers. "When I walked down this aisle, I was treated like a problem to be solved. When I spoke up, I was told to compromise. When I refused, I was called difficult. And when the truth came out, the world started watching. That is the power of exposure. That is the power of refusing to be silent." A young woman near the back raised her phone higher. "He's trending," she whispered to her neighbor, or in her tone. Zoe turned her screen toward Devon. "Mr. Mitchell, there are over 20,000 people watching right now. The hashtag Pinnacle Shame is everywhere. People are sharing their own stories in real time. This is bigger than one flight." Devon nodded. "Good, then let's make it count." His phone buzzed again. Another reporter, another request for comment, another door opening. He silenced it, letting the moment breathe. This was never just about a seat. It is about space. Who gets to claim it, who is expected to surrender it, and why. I will not surrender what I earned, and I will make sure no one else has to either. The passengers erupted, not in cheers, but in something quieter, more powerful, a collective murmur of agreement, the soft thrum of validation. Sensed that they were no longer passive witnesses, but part of something larger. The cabin had become a courtroom, a newsroom, a movement all at once. Devon stood at the center of it, not just a CEO reclaiming his seat, but a man turning humiliation into resolve, turning an insult into a mandate. What began as a confrontation between two passengers had grown into a story watched by thousands, soon to be millions. And with every camera raised, every word recorded, every post shared, the personal injustice of one man was becoming the collective demand of a society no longer willing to be quiet. The reckoning had begun, and Devon Mitchell was no longer just a passenger on flight 1847. He was its turning point. The jet bridge connected with a hollow thud, and the cabin doors swung open to a wall of flashing lights and raised microphones. Devon stepped forward, the aisle parting as passengers watched him go, some still whispering, others recording until the very last second. Outside, the gate area had transformed into a stage. Reporters pressed forward with questions, airport officials gestured frantically, and curious travelers from other flights crowded behind security ropes, their phones raised high. Devon's face was calm, his stride steady. Zoe Kim trailed close behind, her phone angled toward him, her live stream counter climbing past 50,000 viewers. "We still live," she whispered breathlessly, and the words echoed louder than any headline. Devon stopped just beyond the aircraft door, the press tightening around him like a tide. Cameras caught the sweat on Captain Rodriguez's temple as he exited behind him, Sarah Chen's face pale. Victoria Hartwell shielding her eyes from the barrage of flashes. The crowd surged, but Devon held up a hand. The noise subsided, anticipation crackling in the air. "What happened on that plane was not just about me," he said, his voice carrying with a clarity that cut through the chaos. "It was about every person who has ever been told to move, to compromise, to accept less than the dignity they deserve." His words rippled outward, drawing nods from passengers who had witnessed it firsthand. An older black man stepped forward, his voice trembling. "They made me give up my seat once, said it would be easier that way. I never forgot it." A Latina woman beside him added, "I was pulled out of line for extra screening every time I flew. I knew why." Their voices layered into the moment, testimony spilling into the open. Elena Vasquez lifted her recorder higher, her pen racing across her notebook, capturing not just facts, but the heartbeat of a movement. Zoe angled her phone to capture the faces of those speaking, her chat exploding with comments like, "That's my story too, and he's speaking for all of us." Devon's gaze moved from the passengers to the cameras, and then to Zoe's lens, locking onto the invisible millions now watching. His voice dropped into a register that made the crowd lean closer. "The question isn't if I belong here. The question is, will you stand up when it's your turn?" The silence that followed was heavy, not empty but full of thought, of reflection, of the quiet realization that the line between witness and participant had just been erased. Zoe's screen lit with reactions, thousands of hearts flooding upward, messages repeating his words like a chant. "Stand up when it's your turn." Devon let the silence breathe before continuing. "I grounded one flight, but the truth is, every person here, every person watching holds power. Maybe not to redirect a plane, but to say no when you're asked to shrink yourself, to speak when silence feels safer, to lift your phone, your pen, your voice, and refuse to let injustice hide." Behind him, Victoria shrank further into the crowd, her name already circling online as the face of Entitlement Exposed. Sarah Chen and Captain Rodriguez stood stiffly, knowing their choices would be scrutinized long after this night ended. But Devon did not look back. He looked forward, into the flood of lights and lenses. This story will be written about airlines, about technology, about corporate responsibility. But make no mistake, it is also about you. Because when the moment comes, when the eyes are on you, when someone tries to take what is rightfully yours, the decision will not belong to me. It will belong to you. A murmur rose from the crowd, not quite applause, not quite protest, but something more intimate: agreement. Recognition, a collective nod of shared burden. Zoe tilted her phone to capture faces wet with tears, jaws set in determination. Her viewer count soared past 80,000. The hashtag had already gone global. Devon lowered his hand, his voice softer now but no less steady. "This began as a seat I paid for, a seat I was told to surrender. But it ends here as a reminder. Dignity is not negotiable, justice is not optional, and silence is never neutral." He turned then, moving toward the corridor beyond the gate, the crowd parting in his wake. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed, Zoe's phone trembled as she tried to keep up, her audience pleading for one more word. But Devon did not need to say more. The message had already taken root. Behind him, passengers from Flight 1847 spoke into microphones, sharing their pieces of the story. Strangers online added their own memories, their own scars, their own voices to the swelling chorus. The personal confrontation had become public reckoning, and now it was becoming a movement. As Devon disappeared into the terminal, the final image that lingered on every live stream and headline was not his authority as a CEO, not his ability to ground an aircraft, but his challenge to everyone watching. Will you stand up when it's your turn? It was not a question meant for him to answer. It was a question meant to live in the minds of everyone who had seen, everyone who had heard, everyone who now had no excuse to pretend they did not know. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.